Welcome to the Epiphany Series. Thank you for joining us, Chris Carr. I'd like to welcome you to the studio. I'll get straight to the point because for me, this is an opportunity to be educated because I think we were all shocked and brokenhearted with what happened to George Floyd. And I don't think any right-thinking person would wish such behavior on any soul on this planet. If there's anything positive to come out from it, it's this powerful movement which we're seeing at the moment, which is raising awareness about racism as we strive to bring equality into our world. But the reason I really wanted to have this conversation is because a lot of white Caucasian people are now feeling that they need an extra education, both in terms of vocabulary, cultural diversity, and identity wisdom, maybe to ensure that they don't offend people of colour. What would you describe as the key lessons for white people so they can in some way understand the journey that the Black and minority ethnic groups have been on?
I think it's multifaceted and it's kind of layered. This wasn't shocking to me. The police have been brutal towards Black people since the establishment of the police. Really, when I think about it, it's an opportunity for people to learn, but I'm not sure if it is about learning about themselves, but actually learning about history and learning about culture and learning about the reality of colonialism. And when I look at the social unrest, well, this happened 3 years ago when Eric Garner was murdered, and the same time period as 2 or 3 other people. This happened 15 years ago, or even longer when I was in high school with Amadou Diallo, with numerous people being murdered in between. This isn't a new trend. And so people that are interested in understanding are gonna have to put in effort. We have to deal with rehumanizing. One of the colonial enterprises is dehumanization and objectification and us being turned into products of work, of activity. So are you an artist? Are you a lawyer? Are you white? Are you Black? These are all constructions of activity. And instead of us just being humans and holistic in that humanity, we've been reduced to that. And so we have to take time and be revolutionary in our effort to rehumanize. And I don't mean revolutionary in the sense of grab a gun or burn a building down, but to not accept the status quo and be willing to sacrifice, be willing to put in time, put in effort, be empathetic, be compassionate to fellow humans and listen to them and understand that we don't all have the same experience. And when we think about equality, yes, we'd like everything to be equal, but we're starting in such different places that we have to look at equity and that it may take more effort from certain people than others to get to a space of equality and similar experience. So what I would suggest for folks is to possibly recenter their interests. And instead of the idea of non-Black folks saying, well, I don't want to offend people, it's more an idea of I want to understand the experience of other people and allow them to dictate that path and that process. When we hear the word ally, or we hear this concept of basically non-Black folks like not wanting to be the bad white person, I'm not sure if that's the right entry point. When we hear this idea of, well, how can I help? I'm not sure if that's the right entry point. Some of it is, what's the phenomena? We need to understand what actually is. And the only people that understand that are the people that experienced it. So it means actually having connection to that community with people in that community. And if we don't have the ability to do that, like let's say you're in Ireland where there's so few people of African descent that are from America, then how do we use proxies, whether it's books, literature, movies, documentaries? When people do speak, make sure we listen and then follow the breadcrumbs they leave us. But it's not something that can be managed in a day, a 1 week workshop, 1 month. You know, it's a process of understanding humanity. And we aren't taught to know history. Part of the colonial process is also to erase the historical process of that colonialism. Because then we might start losing faith in some of the institutions that we believe in. But I've already lost faith in those things. The Constitution of America says that people of African descent were to be counted as 3/5 of a person for taxation purposes. We were not citizens. We were looked at as property when the Constitution was signed. In the 13 colonies, slavery was legal and allowed in all 13. And so it's not just North and South. It's not like, well, once the Civil War ended, it all got good for us. No, there were still things happening now that are deeply rooted in the institutions of colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, segregation that are in place now, whether it's with the government or private entities or interpersonal contact.
So how have we got to this place? We're all souls, aren't we? We're all the same. And the only reason the skin color is different is originally because so we could survive in the place we were born. And yet, why are human beings and souls using this just to judge people? It's almost incomprehensible, no?
So, depending on how we look at it, the will to power, as Nietzsche speaks of it, is something that humans have had to deal with. And is there a reason why we seek the ability to impose our will on others, why we seek to be able to manipulate the environment around us and change it? Is there something inherent in humanity that leads us to utilize violence as a tool, whether it's for change, for protection, for manipulation? And is that a balance? There's this idea of like the Manichean duality within humans, or various groups have talked about this dichotomy, and whether it exists holistically as like a unified duality where we exhibit both, or whether it's exhibited as we're constantly fighting with each other internally and it's not unified. It's this like partitioning, like the good and the bad in us. That seems to be part of the human process, is sorting this out. How can we learn to be good people to each other? We should know inherently, but it seems like we're not. But what happened? And that's a question that isn't well understood. In a book by Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, he posed a question of why was it that Cortez and Hernandez and Columbus came to America, and Quetzalcoatl and the indigenous leaders didn't end up in Europe pillaging? Is there something different socially that led to these occurrences? And really, we don't know. We know that there are differences in how societies developed and the need for resource distribution, and the idea of how violence and weapons are used in order to claim those resources and manage them. But we really don't understand. But we do know that in the colonial process, it has been kind of a one-way activity in recent times. And one of the levers that was used was skin color. If we look at even before kind of the development of quote unquote white as a term, it was Europeans or others were using how folks look to differentiate and to run on tribalist ideology. There's an idea, well, humans have always had slavery. Since the dawn of humanity, humans have had slavery and been mean to each other. I don't know where someone came up with that. That's not true. That's like a statement made to advocate for colonialization. When you hear where all people are racist, again, that's not true. That's something that's used to advocate for colonialization. We don't even, race is fake, it's a construction. And when even in the statement you made of like why we look different, we don't even understand that. Like there is no actual understanding of human development. From Neanderthal or Australopithecus or Homo habilis to Homo sapiens sapien, there's no missing link. We don't know how we actually came to be. The proto-hominid has never been found. They have never found that thing that establishes a connection between apes and humans. They found these similar things, but they don't know. And then when we think about the expansion, the out of Africa theory is the most prominent. We don't know how come the indigenous people that live far north, like the Inuits, they never lost their pigmentation and they had straight hair. So how'd that happen? We know that there are people in the subcontinent of India that are darker than me, but they don't really look like Africans. And there's been these proposed ideas of the Negroid, the Caucasoid, the Mongoloid, but the scientists don't know. We know that there are genetic markers for pigmentation, for hair type, for eye color, for things of that nature, but there is no differentiator for black or white. And that we have more genetic variation based on blood type than race. And so what we've seen is that people of European descent started creating these general terms as a way for them to stay safe, theoretically. When they got to Australia and they were dealing with the Aborigines, whether it's the German or the British or the Irish, whoever, they realized if they didn't band together as white folks, they weren't going to be able to take over that area. The same thing happened once they got to the US, that when the Dutch were here, the Germans were here, the British were here, the French were here, the Spanish were here, the Portuguese were here, and they're fighting each other back in Europe and had been for hundreds of years. Then they get here and they're like, oh, there are a lot of indigenous people. If we don't band together, we'll lose. oh, we're bringing over Africans, we're bringing over Chinese, we're bringing over Indian. If we don't band together, we'll lose. And so in Australia, they created the white laws. Like literally, that's what it's called. And in the US, they started developing this concept of whiteness in order to band together to eradicate other groups of people. The why is very complicated. And I'm not one that believes, well, it's just the fact that because in Northern Europe, the diets were different, or the need to use violence for protection, or they were living in caves, is an accurate understanding. There are people that propose things like that, and there are some social scientists that have researched it, but I think we are where we are. The how and the why from tens of thousands of years ago isn't really understood. The why from 400 years ago is somewhat understood in the sense of legal systems and the impetus. And so when you're coming out of, let's say, 300 to 400 years of wars, like in Europe, like the quote unquote dark ages, then the colonial process and the need for space becomes apparent. And so you had this expansion, you had this age of exploration. Now, when we think about Columbus wasn't looking to prove the world was round. The church had already admitted from like maybe the 9th, 10th century that the earth was an orb. That was known. Columbus was looking for resources and looking for space and looking for the ability to colonize. Why gets into the idea of these dynasties and monastic rule and the idea of kind of divine right. And so now you're into the esoteric. We're into mentality coupled with the navigation ability, the boats, and time matching. Maybe Europeans were under the rule of Asian and Africans for 10,000 years before. And now this is their 800-year run, or this is their 400-year run. We don't really know what's going on. And so I think now it's a time for people to step up and to accept that it's going to be hard. And that if folks want to understand, there is information, but they're going to have to put in effort.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly done your research there. Very impressive. Wow. That was an education for me. Thank you. Now, on a forum that I set up during COVID-19, there's been a bit of discussion about the Black Lives Matters movement. And there was confusion at the beginning between that and the All Lives Matter movement, because I think some people felt that Black Lives Matter was very focused on one thing. Can you just explain for people who don't know in simple terms what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about?
Okay, so we want to separate movement from movement as a entity or a brand or nonprofit organization from purpose and idea. The idea came out of the death, I believe, of Trayvon Martin or another young person, and where it was made perfectly clear that people don't care about Black people in America. People do not value our lives in America. And that's historic. When you are listed as property in the Constitution, how is your humanity cared for? How is there an understanding? When the state enforces segregation, how are we cared for? When we are then expected to adapt and adjust to society in the end of segregation, when we're still not given access to the same resources, how are we cared for? When we have a prison industrial complex that utilizes us as the labor force and the basis for it, and is a continuation of modern day slavery, how are we cared for? How is it our lives matter to people? I literally, when you go out and you watch people walk around, and you try to explain to them or speak to them about some of these issues, they tell you they don't care. They let you know that it doesn't affect them enough for them to care, or that it would require too much effort on their part to alter it. And so that's a real sentiment of people of African descent worldwide being landless people. If you look around the globe, what happened to the Aborigines? If you look around the globe, what happens in Sri Lanka? Why are they treated by the Northern Indians in certain ways? How dark are they? When you look in Zimbabwe, South Africa, there was a time period in Zimbabwe where over 90% of the land was owned by Europeans, which only made up less than 20% of the population. We know about the apartheid movement in South Africa. And again, I stand with people, so I don't want anyone to misconstrue what I'm going to say. But if you look at the development of Israel, the Jordanians and the British, who had already annexed land from brown people, gave it to people of European descent who had been hurt by other Europeans instead of taking land from Europeans. And so around the world, we notice this anti-Blackness. And so the Black Lives Matter movement started out of an idea of see our humanity, treat us like other humans. Now, the growing organization and brand and how that's worked, I won't attest to that. I don't ascribe to any organization. I'm not oriented to the Young Democrats, Young Republicans, socialist groups. I'm a human, I'm a person. The police have murdered people I know. My friend Surfeld got killed by the cops. My other friend Vaughn got shot by the cops. The police have brutalized people I know. The only person to ever pull a gun on me in an aggressive manner was a police officer. So when I'm saying that my life matters, that ties into Black Lives Matter. When I'm saying that I want to be treated as a human in this country, that's what's owed, equal protection under the law. I pay my taxes, the police are supposed to protect me. And if they do their job improperly, they should be punished. And when it happens to other people, they are punished. So that should happen when it's done to people of African descent. And so I stay rooted there. So when we have the All Lives movement, that's just I think people who are unaware of the origin of the Black Lives movement, and more people that are, without knowing it, being white supremacists. And their feelings are more important than the lives of other people. And their idea of not wanting to face the reality of history. Now, they don't all have malicious intent. When I say white supremacists, I don't mean Nazis. I don't mean alt-right, quote unquote hillbillies. What I mean are people that want to continue a system where ethnocentrism is the norm, where they only read books by people of European descent, where they only go to schools that have syllabi dictated by people of European descent, where they only watch movies and get media owned by people of European descent, where they only center European understanding of the world. Like this idea of even human psychology. Most people would say, oh, well, Freud is the father of psychology. And we know he had problems, but then there was Adler and there was Jung and there was, you still naming Europeans. Well, do we have any understanding? When we talk about philosophers, who's a Black philosopher? People be like, well, Africans didn't write things down. Of course, Africans wrote things down. Cuneiform and hieroglyphics were pictorial, but there were scribes. At the same time as these pictographs were available, people were writing. And the library was in Alexandria, economics in Timbuktu and Mali and Sangay and Axum had written documents, and they were destroyed and burned to advocate for this false narrative. So I think when people talk about Blue Lives Matter, people talk about All Lives Matter, my first point is I hope they're just uninformed. But then my next step would be to say, well, they're being anti-Black and under the guise of something else.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for making that clear. I think if there was any misunderstanding, it was probably just because of a lack of knowledge. But as you say, I think it's our duty to start caring and to start actually looking into this and educating ourselves, which I like to think is why we're here now. And
yeah, real quick and I know I'm prodding on purpose, is I throw events in Brooklyn, and I've been doing events out here the past 10, 12 years. I was really excited when I moved to Brooklyn with all the warehouse parties and all the illegal kind of like, they weren't raves because the music had changed and it's not the 90s or 80s, whatever, but it was the same principle. And I saw then the kind of development of the Brooklyn burner scene. And it has been highly marginalized and highly not welcoming of Black folks. And so I wouldn't say that it's just out of lack of awareness. I would say that there are plenty of people who have been confronted with that marginalization and who do not want to hear about it, do not want to educate, have no concern. And when we look on whole at the burner scene, it has never been super inclusive, as it spoke about universal humanity. And so I'd like to really challenge people and push people and give them a call to action of maybe check in and really, really think about it. Who's been trying to have these conversations? When people of color, as well as Black people, because I don't want to lump them together. People of color and Black people have a much different experience and overlap. There's a Venn diagram of Black people, yes, are people of color. When we look at the Black experience, we aren't included in some of these conversations. We are purposely kept out of the room on some of these conversations. And we need to really focus and sit with that. And I know in your group, we're oriented to healing and universal understanding, but sometimes that becomes a cloak and a way for people to then not deal with the history of racism, because they're like, well, we love everybody. Let's not talk about that. We want to have good vibes. Let's not nitpick at each other. And it's like, we need to really get into what the issue is sometimes. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No. I hear you. I hear you. So again, this is me trying to understand the situation more. Having spoken to a few people, it seems there's a generational divide as well, even within the African American community and the Black communities. Because a couple of people I've spoken to of the older generation, the elders, they seem to be more accepting of the past because I guess that's the way it's always been. And what is beautiful is to see this young generation coming through, like yourself, this passionate generation who is saying, no, the threshold of acceptance has changed and there is literally no tolerance of this anymore. We cannot carry on like this. Is this something that you've witnessed? Are you aware of it? Have you this slightly generational difference in attitude?
Well, I think one of the difficulties when you're in a minority group is the expectation for consensus or unified thought. And that's never going to be the case. I mean, if you speak to non-Black folks and you say, well, do you think abortion should be legal or not? You got a huge divide. You know, millions of people disagree. We talk about should the capital punishment or the death penalty be in place? Millions of people divided. How should our economic system work? Millions of people divided. How should our social services system work? Should everyone have health care? Millions of people divided. And so within the Black community, there's going to be division. There's going to be arguments. There's going to be lack of consensus. And I don't know if it's just age, because my aunt is 80 years old. She wanted to go march. And we had to tell her, you're not allowed to go out there. COVID is still real. You are in a group of folks that need to protect themselves. Figure out another way to participate. Sure. My mom is flipping out. She's 78 years old. And she and my aunt were both involved in the civil rights movement. And so I think it's easy to find examples of the other. And it's easy to always find exceptions to rules or have difficulty establishing a rule because we aren't monolithic as a culture. Depending on where you live geographically, depending on your economic status, depending on what you were involved with, even the civil rights movement. My grandparents did not like the idea of my aunt and mom going out and marching and didn't like the idea of how the civil rights movement worked in certain ways, while yet they, of course, wanted equity. And of course, they wanted to be treated as equal citizens. Some people agreed more with Malcolm X. Some people agreed more with Martin Luther King Jr. Some people worked with both of them. Some people didn't like any of it. Yeah. And so I think the difficulty is people want to, and I don't mean every human, but there are people that would like simple solutions to very difficult, complicated, complex social problems that took hundreds, if not thousands of years to develop. And it's just not there. There is no one size fits all answer. There's no, let me spoon feed you what you should think, how to respond. There's a reality of we're humans, and most humans are bungling through life. Most of us have no idea what we're doing, and we learn via trial and error, and we learn from the people around us. And when we have so little information available, how are we going to learn? Sure. The media does not portray it accurately. I want anyone who sees this to know that protests are still going on. People are in front of the White House or down in Washington, D.C. right now, but because it's not violent, the media is not covering it. When we think about, well, we don't like the protests and people rioting. People tried kneeling with Colin Kaepernick, and the president castigated him. People tried marching peacefully. People tried speaking to their legislators. People have used the legal outlets, and it hasn't changed it. And some of the people, quote unquote, rioting aren't people of color, aren't Black. They aren't tied to the organizations that are, I guess, the impetus for the march. It's outsiders that are coming in and taking advantage of it. There are people, because it's on the internet, and it's not just like, yo, Pete, we need to organize together. Call your friend. Let me call my friend. Let's send a letter to the homies. It's not that. It goes up on the internet. Anyone can show up. They put on a mask. They break a storefront. All of a sudden, Black Lives Matter is supportive of looting. No, that's not the case. But even if it were the case, riots are the language of an unheard people. And how did the U.S. start getting its freedom? Boston Tea Party. They destroyed property. In capitalism, property becomes more important than people. So how do you make people aware of you as a person? Destroy their property. Start blocking up their economic flow. Boycott, blockade, stand in the street so the trucks can't deliver whatever and the banks can't make money. People start listening then. Now, again, I'm a pacifist. I do not advocate violence in any way, and which means I will never advocate for a violent state. The paramilitary police, oppressive force, has to change. And if I have to choose whose violence is worse, the police. I'm not worried about these companies that have insurance. Now, again, I do not advocate for violence, but the people that are being murdered by the police, they don't have insurance. The police aren't being punished for their action. So what do we do with that?
Yeah. Wow. Wow. So, okay, you're the president of the United States. For 10 minutes, what would you do? What can we do? I mean, I realize that this is a long-term process, but is there something that they could do at the top level which could really wake people up?
I think so. One, I would never want to be the president. I think there's something pathological about people that believe them and their 400 friends should dictate what happens to 360 million people.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the starting points of where it's all wrong, and the collection of power in so few hands. But I would start with not dismissing the cause for what people need, and I would not encourage and foment more racist, divisive groups and activities. I would have publicly, not just because Trump likes to do things where he plays both sides of the fence. So he brought in the families of these people who had family members murdered and sat with them. And he expressed his concern and his feeling about it, and then came out and gave a pro-police speech. And if you're in business, you know, sometimes people do double speak. If they're negotiating, they tell both parties what they need to hear in order to get what they need out of the negotiation. I would possibly be able to sacrifice. I would possibly say, you know what? Let's actually learn the history of what's happened to people of African descent in this country and apologize. Actually take action and physical steps. I'm not a huge fan of the concept of reparations because I don't know how you would identify who the Black people are that should get it. I don't know what the octoroons, the quadroons, the people that never claim Black, only people who've been here over 100 years. But we need to start figuring out reconciliation and start thinking about restorative justice and start thinking about what did the state do to make sure we couldn't buy houses? Start correcting that. What did the state do to make sure that our land was taken and stripped from us and we were dispossessed? What can we do about that? The USDA has been sued numerous times about racist practices and had to settle out of court. They've admitted it. What do we do about the history of imbalance with justice? The State Department, as well as the Justice Department, has had to admit the imbalance. And so we know that it's there, but on the presidential level, we're not addressing it. On the highest level in the Supreme Court, we're electing officials and appointing officials to the Supreme Court who don't believe that the state should be involved in rectifying that. And in my mind, those are starting points if we're dealing with structure. Is let's go to the legislation, let's go to the orientation, let's go to the state level, the local level, the federal level, and start fixing this problem in a structural sense. But it's also the people. That one of the beauties and one of the difficulties with America is you can't just impose ideology on everybody. That's fascism. We actually have to allow people to have the information and the impetus and the inspiration, as well as the incentive to learn and to grow and change and to incentivize that change. And that can't really be imposed. And what the president could do is reward those who are informing folks, reward folks who are engaged in that fight and engaged in that revolutionary process. What the president could do is set aside funds for research and studies and to really investigate some of these things and to support the groups that have been doing it 60 years. The civil rights movement was in the 50s, 60s. There have been people who've been engaged in this conversation for over 60, 70, 80 years. They're abolitionists. There are people since the end of the 1880s, 1890s that started organizations that deal with stuff like this. Empower them, draw attention to them, work with them, instead of castigating the communities that want change.
Huh. I mean, Maya Angelou talks about, you mentioned the past there. She talks about going back is not necessarily the best way forward. I think it's necessary to go back to do justice to all the things that have been done in the past to then repair the future. Do you think that's a place they have to go, or do you think it's better to just look forward?
If there are people that don't need historical evidence in order to make decisions about the future, then, you know, bless them. I'm glad they're able to have that foresight and they have the wherewithal to do that. Most people respond, though, to phenomena and examples and history. So that if I were to tell you, hey, I'd like to really have a future of peace and love and joy and nonviolence, and you're like, yeah, but why? And I'm like, oh, because as a child. Now, this didn't happen to me. But if as a child, because I was abused and that violence caused trauma, which led to me traumatizing other people. And I want to break the cycle. All of a sudden, we root that in person. All of a sudden, we have a reason that we can align with. And we can say, well, wow, we have a common past because you and I both have had trauma from violence and want to break that cycle.
Sure.
And we have connectivity. I'm not saying that the quote is correct, but this idea of like, we don't know the history, we're doomed to repeat it. Yeah. You know, like if we're not aware of what we really, I'm a fan of existential crisis. When I work in a high school, one of the things that we talk about is existential crisis. And we're not here to learn off the principle of, well, math is more important than English, or you have to be smart so you're better than people, or go get a job. We're born and it's confusing. And all these things are tools to let us understand the world around us. How did we get here? Why are we here? What are we here to do? And part of that question is a historical question. Part of that question is we understand identity based on the environment in which we're born and the society that helps form us and that's around us. It's nurture and nature. And so it would be really hard to make a plan for the future and not understand the past.
Yeah.
But I will say this, I don't think we need to dwell in the negativity. I think maybe what Maya Angelou is rooted in is we don't need to constantly retell Black people that they're from some pathological past, because I don't agree with that either. I think, if anything, we need to spin that on its head and explain that the oppressor has lost its humanity. When we dehumanize and we objectify and we can brutalize the humans in our community and not see them as human, we've lost our humanity, because part of humanity is seeing ourselves in others. Part of our humanity is camaraderie and empathy and sympathy. And if we lose that, we've lost part of our humanity and need to regain that. And so the oppressor group may need to learn a bit about how they've lost their humanity and how they're not quite the bastion of grace and truth and amazingness that they may think, and that they may need to learn a bit more about their own history to then correct it. And to say like, wow, most people don't know less than 2% of rural land is owned by Black people in this country. How did that happen? Well, that's rooted in then slavery, and that's rooted in a history. And they're like, whoa, well then how are Black people supposed to attain wealth? And capitalism, land is a starting point for wealth accumulation and generational wealth. And when we find out that the state stopped it, when we find out that illegal practices were involved, people want to make a change. When people really learn about the prison industrial complex, they want to make a change. Most people who support our prison industrial complex have never been into a prison. You go into a prison and you see the way people are treated, you really don't want to advocate for that. And so I think it's important for us to take advantage of the educational resources we have, you know?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people who are going to be watching this are probably, they work for a company and they want to learn about, I mean, for example, I'll give you an example of where I work for a sports federation in what you would call track and field. And it's all white people right across the board, the executive committee, all the way down. It's not a huge company. And a lady of color came to work for us, and she did some incredibly creative work in terms of interviewing. She's an athlete as well. She brought a whole new level of talent to the company. But after what happened to George Floyd, she took a look at the federation, and she just said, I can't work here anymore. Because for her, it didn't represent athletics on the track. Because literally, you know, on the track, I think in Europe, probably looking at 30-40% of the athletes are of color. And so she said it can't continue like this, and until this changes, I can't work here. And respect to her for doing that. What can federations, companies do to understand diversity, to make sure that they can bring in all the most talented people for the right reasons and look beyond the skin color?
This is a very tough question, because the answer is before them. And do they really want the result? Because if you end up with diversity, things that have been allowed for 150 years will change. And people that have been able to say and do certain things will no longer be able to say and do those things. And do they really want that change? It seems like they don't. I think a starting point is to do what she did. If you look around and where you work, there are no women, quit and sacrifice. But can I really ask that of people? Of course not. Like I can't tell people affect their lives in such a drastic manner. But maybe I can. Maybe that's actually a simple solution. If everyone who works for somewhere that is not balanced, not diverse, quit then these companies will change. Now there's this idea of, well, no, they'll just find other people that are cool with racism. That's also possibly true. And there are enough people who are cool with racism where it may not change stuff. So then there's the idea of have people inside, and you want to work the problem from the inside. And hopefully you provide an environment that is welcoming enough so that people of color, or Black people specifically, won't leave and see that they have an opportunity to change and influence these entities and these companies. But we're dealing with a chicken and egg kind of self-perpetuating cycle of, if there's no one in power that's of African descent or of color, then the people who come in will be disrespected and will be pushed out, or will not be heard and will not feel seen and would rather go work somewhere where they are seen. And so you have to start at an executive level. One of the heads of Reddit quit and said, the board needs to put someone in color or a Black person in their position. Now, the irony in that someone from Reddit is now advocating for people of color is that Reddit is one of the seedbeds of some of the most racist groups we have in our country. And so I don't know how you manage all this stuff. I'll be honest, I don't know what people of European descent are supposed to do. I don't know what white people are supposed to do. They have made such a mess, and I don't mean every white person, but I mean structurally, like this process of colonialism, have made such a mess of social structure. And it's taken so long, it's been through such concerted effort, that I don't know how you dig yourself out of that hole. Even if you stop digging now, you are so deep in a hole that you can't climb out. You can't use the shovel to stand on and then get out of the hole. I don't know what's supposed to happen. And I've had this conversation with folks from Europe where, I've had roommates who are from, I don't know how many different countries, Belgium, Netherlands, UK, Spain, Germany, Italy. And you get this like, wow, racism in the US is horrible. We don't have that. I've been to London. I've seen how racism works out there. I have homies that are Sudanese that are in Ireland. They'll tell you how racism works out there. I have friends who have North African and Turkish descent that are all through Scandinavia, through Germany, and they'll tell you about how racism works. And so it's like a worldwide anti-darkness, anti-Blackness, anyone who's not European problem. And so I don't know if I'm the one to have the solution, because it didn't come out of my culture, my cultural being. And if people of European descent don't want to address it's real, I don't know how they're going to fix it. If they don't want to address how they just are dealing with Black Pete, and I know it's your name, sorry, Pete, but Black Pete in the Netherlands, they're just finally accepting it. For decades, people have been explaining that the thing is racist, and now they're finally saying, all right, let's work on this. If we don't want to look at how people of immigrant communities are viewed in our communities, if we don't want to look at, wow, do we treat people of lighter skin differently? Is there an anti-darkness worldwide system, an anti-Blackness thing going on? Are we going to be able to get to the solution? And are we willing to do the hard work? I would say when companies are actually invested, I do diversity training, then they are willing to spend the money to bring in executives and bring in people at the C-suite level and at the executive level to start, not like trickle-down economics, because that doesn't work, but top-down activity to establish structure within the entity and to provide inspiration for people that come in, and bottom-up in the sense of bringing in young people, bringing in people with new ideas, bringing in people that are diverse in thought, not just how they look. Because you can bring in people that look just like me, and they'll say the same things that someone did 40 years ago because they know that's what allows them to keep a job. What you need is diversity of thought, as well as how people look in their life experiences, so that you get it from top and bottom till it floods throughout the whole entity. And you may lose money. You may lose sponsorship. You may lose attachment to rural communities that enjoy racist tropes. You may have to spend time rebranding. And if we think of how long, let's say in Hollywood, they're like, well, we want to do different images, but we don't know how to market and sell those movies. It took you 80 years to figure out how to sell certain types of movies. It might take you a little while. It might take you some effort. Like diamonds weren't associated with getting married 150, 200 years ago. Certain industries, De Beers and Tiffany's and other organizations got together and said, how do we create a diamond market? And they spent the time and money to do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like I've learned so much. There's a huge difference then between being a non-racist and being an anti-racist. And racism is where we need to go. And it sounds to me like we, as the white people who are seemingly not caring, and by not caring, that is not investing time to understand, we need to go down that road and take this to another level, so we can understand what you guys, the journey you guys have been on, but not just the journey, but also, so the world can be a place which is fair, equal, and loving. Is that fair to say, or have I misunderstood you?
No, I think my goal is, or what I'm interested in is, yes, humanity being able to love one another in totality, and for us to be able to be our whole selves, for us to be able to be fully human and recognize the humanity in another person. I believe that phrase, namaste, I know it's used for like kind of hippy dippy, like yoga, but theoretically, from my understanding, it's just that the God in me sees a God in you. I recognize your divinity. I recognize your whole being, not just this physical shell, not just the way we look in this physical shell, not just the way I present now, but the totality of my full being. And I want to recognize other people's full beings, and want to be recognized as such. So that requires love. That requires connectivity. That requires not just using these eyes, but the universal eye, and that takes time. It's just like to work on your body, to try to be healthy. It's not easy. We're constantly given shortcuts that are not healthy for us. And so I think it does require more than just the status quo. I will say the status quo is white supremacy in most white majority situations. And again, that doesn't mean hate. It doesn't mean these people even recognize their own white supremacy. But it's this idea of, where do we center truth? Where do we center importance? Where do we center trust? Where do we center our ideas and our mental pictures? And when we have an imagination and we can write a book and we can create a new story, or we can create marketing tools, how can we keep repeating the same things over and over again? There are plenty of other narratives that are available. And that's going to take effort to go seek them out and support them. And to be willing to sacrifice when your friends make fun of you, when the coworkers say that's not important, when your bosses say, hey, we're not interested in that. It's going to take time for people to be like, this is important. And VP of the company, whoever you are, can you sit down? Can we have a meeting? And let's not argue, but can I explain to you why these things are important? And when the VP is like, you know what, I don't like you anymore. No going on golf trips. And now you don't get a promotion. That's part of the sacrifice. And are we willing to do that? Because that's what people in my community have had to do for I don't know how many hundreds of years. We had to sacrifice. There's a famous abolitionist, and I'm not going to say this is how to be a compatriot, because again, the word ally is difficult. But if you want to be a compatriot, you want to be a friend, you want to be a comrade, and not in the sense of the Russian Revolution comrade, but like just camaraderie and being joined in action, it means common work. It means collective action. And so when John Brown helped take over Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, they took over a munitions dump or ammunition site, he got hanged. I mean, he was punished. Like, you don't get the milk and honey when you're engaged in certain activities. And again, I am not an advocate for violence. I'm a pacifist. I do not believe in violence. But when you are engaged in certain acts, it's going to require sacrifice. It's going to require maybe not getting that cookie at the end of the day, or maybe not having, that extra $30,000, $40,000 you could have had. It may be only get 80,000 and you'd be all right. Like, you can handle that.
Wow. Okay, I hear you. Well, thank you so much for dedicating time to educate everyone who's watching this. I think it's been a lesson for me, and also it's opened my eyes, and I think I've realized the difference now between non-racism and anti-racism, and it's really important that I start to study this. Is there any books that you recommend we read? I know we spoke about this before. Is there something that you recommend anyone who wants to know more about this subject?
I being a historian, I say start at the beginning. And so let's look at colonialism in general. If you don't want to read something by a Black person, then Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel is a starting point. It was a bestseller. You don't have to be an academic to understand it. But he gets into this idea of how humans developed and the way we look at property, the way we look at resource distribution, and some historical events that led to where we are now. And he was a botanist. He came across it when he was working with folks that he was in Papua New Guinea. And then his understanding of plant migration and how humans domesticated plants took him into this step-by-step layer of understanding how humans control the environments around them. If you are looking for literature written by people of African descent, which I suggest if you want to understand this, then Chancellor Williams has a book called The Destruction of Black Civilization. Walter Rodney has a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Franz Fanon wrote a book called Wretched of the Earth. Paulo Freire, I believe, wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Then you have the ISIS Papers by Francis Cress Welsing. You have literature by Angela Davis that's more contemporary, more modern. You have The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. White Fragility, who's also by a non-Black person. I don't remember the name of that author, but they deal with why it's so difficult for people of European descent to even address these topics. And then there are book lists. I mean, literally, if you go on the Black Lives Matter website, they have a whole syllabus of books, of articles, of things you can read. The gentleman Coates, who wrote for The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates, he writes a lot and gives some great kind of breadcrumbs for you to follow. And there are tons of African-American studies programs where they have book lists and in various departments, whether you want to know about architecture, land ownership, and city planning. There's a book by a gentleman, Andre Perry, called, what is this? It's leaving me right now, but it deals with the undervalue of Black property.
We can put that link underneath here anyway. Once you remember, you can send me that.
Yeah, but Andre Perry is the author, and he works for the Brookings Institute.
Okay.
There is so much information available, and we can start, where we are, and to try to find the things we're interested in. Are we more interested in politics, history, women's, and the experience of Black women in this country, in America, or worldwide? And when it comes to reproductive rights and forced sterilization programs, or when it comes to the mortality rates for infants and why it's so disproportionate. There is information available for people. And I think, well, before we go, I did want to say one thing is like, this isn't about white people feeling guilty. This isn't about hate. It's going to take more than hate for us to get anywhere in this universe. But it is about loving common humans. And it is about understanding that there's a real experience that people who are of African descent have had worldwide. And like you said, being anti-racist, it means action. It means activity. It means being proactive. It's not just waiting for information to get to you. It's not just allowing things to continue. It's putting an effort. And are we willing to do that? And I hope we are. I believe that we are. I'm delusionally hopeful. I'm a firm believer that the human brain is an analogy-based problem-solving computational device. We are made to deal with new phenomena and adapt and grow and learn. And anyone who'd like to talk to me, I'll make sure you have my info, but hit me up. My name is Chris Carr. I run an organization called Black Land Ownership. I run an arts community called BK Wildlife. And come talk to me. If you want me to come into your building, let's do it. You want me to come talk to your company? Let's do it. You want me to talk to you and your friends? Let's do it. I'm working with a psychologist to try to develop a family program so that people can learn to speak to their parents and their uncles and their nieces. But I recognize some of that isn't just about racism. Some of that's about they just don't like each other and we'll need some family counseling.
We can't do anything about that.
So we got to bring in a counselor for that. I don't do counseling, but we can have these discussions. And I think there's information available. There are people out here doing the work and who've been doing it far longer than me. And remember, we won't all say the same thing. You could have brought on 15 other people, have this conversation, and probably got 15 different explanations. And so part of it is doing the research. Be critical thinkers, and learn. And we'll see that you get the thesis, the antithesis, and we make a synthesis, and we understand.
Chris Carr, it's been an absolute honor. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us.
Thank you. I appreciate you stepping out and taking the time to connect with me. My alarm clock didn't go off, and so I'm glad you were able to take this extra time. And even though I was late, normally I am on time. I know people hear these social whatevers, but I'm normally 5 minutes early on these type of discussions. I'm excited for them. And so I'm glad you're willing to do the work and that you're concerned about the community you're a part of. I think, again, that's where these things start. We're community. We're connected. We're all humans in this universal community. And so thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll get to meet in person one day.
I know. I got to get overseas. We got to get me on these planes.
I was thinking about me actually going over there.
When you get here, you're welcome. I don't know if you like to kick around the soccer ball or the football, but we got one over here and we can hang out.
That'd be great. That'd be great. Well, you're always welcome here as well. I live in France, and you're more than welcome to come to France anytime. So
Awesome.
thank you. Okay. Well, take care, Chris. And I'd love to see your art as well. Have you? If you, is there anywhere I
Yeah,
can?
I'll give you my links. If you want to find me on Instagram, my art link is Eat the Cake NYC, and you can see my photography there. My music is all over the place, but I'm in a group called Parn Hash and Co. And if you look up Parn Hash Nakovsky, you'll find me. I use that name because I'm the only one on the internet that has that name. But honestly, if you look up Chris Carr, Brooklyn Wildlife, you'll find all my stuff. Like, I'm on the internet. I do a lot on Facebook. I'm learning how to use Instagram. I'm not really a big fan of TikTok because I don't do dances. I don't jump off the buildings and do backflips. But I'm available, and come hit me up, come find me, and I'll exchange art. I make too much stuff. Like, I'm a hyper creative. I'm horrible at marketing it, but I make stuff all the time, and I don't know how to sell it. I like making it. I like sharing it with people in real life. We do independent shows, and I work with hundreds of other artists. So if you are looking for folk artists that are of African descent, I know them. You're looking for metal artists, I know them. And people that are from all over the world. We work with Korean artists, Japanese artists, Kenyan artists, South African artists, Haitian artists, French artists, Belgian. I work with people. If you are doing the work, let's work together.
I love that. I love that. Do you know any Australian Aboriginal artists? Because I'd love to get some of that artwork.
I have some friends. They're in a group called Curse of Dialect.
Okay.
And their group is a mix of people. They're based out of Australia and out of New Zealand. And they have Aboriginal, Maori, what's the other guy? He's Macedonian, Australian. I mean, so their group is of 13 different people, and they have folks from all over. And they are a great start. Curse of, with the OV, dialect.
Curse of dialect. Okay, I'll take a note of that. Great. Well, thank you, Chris. I'll leave you in peace now. But honestly, you've really blown me away with what you said, and I've realised I've got a lot more to learn as well. So, always learning.
I'm always learning. And anyone watching this, you don't have to look on the internet to be like, well, let me find a problem he has. I have problems also. There are things I need to keep learning. I am not perfect. I'm not acting as if I know everything. It's a constant lifelong learning process. I am a flawed human. I am bungling through life like everybody else.
We're all perfect, Chris. We're all perfect. But yes, the beautiful thing is you're creative, and I think that's a really key part of being happy, isn't it?
Yeah, we're getting there. And to be honest, I got diagnosed with melanoma last year, and I got my pinky toe amputated. So I only have 4 toes on my right foot.
Wow.
And I'm going through immunotherapy. I'm losing pigment due to my immunotherapy treatment.
Yeah.
And so my partner got diagnosed with appendix cancer earlier last year. And so she's interested in your group for some of the healing stuff.
Yeah.
And she's going through her healing process. And so we're blessed. We're alive. We're here. We're sharing. But I'll tell you, it has been a journey. And so I am happy every day I wake up. And I feel blessed every day. And I'm working on myself. And life. Some of these arguments are out there to me. I'm here. I'm in the every day we lucky. Let's live. Let's learn. Let's love. Because we don't know how long we're gonna be here. So let's celebrate. Let's make the best of it. And my whole life has been reoriented in the past year. And so I'm here with you, man.
Wow. Aho. Thank you.